Hi, this is Dave in the IQ Center with another tutorial on how to paint objects in Cinema 4D. This is sort of part 2. This is how to paint textures by hand onto your objects. So something a little more complicated than the previous video that you may have watched. So I'm going to start off with a refresher on how to do booleans, since this is something that people have been doing a lot of in our projects. So let's bring in an object. I'm going to bring in a cylinder. And then let's say we want to cut away the cylinder and make it look like a cross-section. I've seen a lot of projects that have a similar piece to them. So we're going to bring in a cube, and we're going to make that cube cut away part of our cylinder. So just line it up like this. And then we bring in a boolean. From this menu, drop a bool in, and then put the cube and the cylinder into the bool. Okay, now as you see, we have subtracted that. Now at this point, it's still completely editable. If we don't like exactly how that's lined up, we can click the cube within the boolean and move it around live, and we can try different, get it looking exactly the way we want it. And if you turn your display from garage shading to garage shading with lines, you can see what the geometry is looking like. And don't worry if you get some weird pattern of polygons on that face. That's just what happens. We can try switching our boolean from high quality to low quality, and see which looks better. In this case, doesn't really matter. So there's our object, and now what we want to do is maybe paint on that. We want to show like maybe what this looks like on the inside, so we need to paint some details on the inside. So this is a little more complex than applying textures to individual polygons, because we have a bunch of weird shaped polygons here, and we want to paint across them. So we're going to make a texture and paint onto it. So to do that, we need to first of all make this thing editable. So once we are happy with the way our boolean looks, we can select the boolean and click Make Editable. And what that does is it makes it into a polygon shape that's not dependent on a boolean. And now we can see there are two objects, a cylinder and a cube. These things can be combined, but we don't really need to combine them right now. So you can see that the cylinder part of it is this part, and the cube part is this other little angled shape. So it's okay to leave them like that. In fact, if we only need to paint one of these pieces, it makes things a little bit easier to leave them separate. So to make this paintable, we have to use a part of Cinema 4D called body paint. And if you go up to the layout in the upper right, there are a whole bunch of different layouts. And at the 3 down is one called BP UV Edit. That stands for Body Paint UV Edit. And so we're going to go to that layout. And what you see here is a little odd. In the upper right, this is showing you where all of the polygons in your object are and how they will fall onto the texture. So textures are rectangular flat pieces that get wrapped onto your object. And so in Cinema 4D, what you need to do is unwrap all of the polygons onto a flat texture. And so this is not really going to do what we want, because you can see that there's a lot of overlapping polygons. So if we paint onto one thing, it's going to actually show up in multiple areas. So we need to do a few things, and the easiest way to do it is with a wizard. Cinema 4D has a paint setup wizard in the tools at the top here. This takes care of a few steps that normally you have to do by hand. So if I start by clicking that body paint setup wizard, and the first thing is it's going to bring up a list of all of the objects in your entire document. So if you've been working on your project for a while, you may see many items in here. For us, we only have 2 because we have those 2 pieces, the cylinder and the cube. I'm going to leave them both checked to show you how this works, but you can just do one or everything. And what it's going to do is it's going to lay out our pieces onto our texture. So we have both things selected, so we're going to hit the next key, and here it's asking how do we want to map this onto, how do we want to map our surfaces onto our flat texture? And I've had good luck with this optimal cubic mapping. So leave it set at its default here, and then we're going to and the other thing is it's asking you, do we want to make a single material? Single material means that it will lay out all the polygons for multiple objects onto a single texture. And this is probably what you want to do, unless your object is very complicated. So we hit the next key, and now it's asking us some things about how our texture is going to be created. For a color 3D printing project, the only thing that we want to add is color. You can also, in a more complicated project for something else, you have the ability to add all these other channels. But for us, we're going to just do color. And then here it's asking us what the size should be. The textures in Cinema 4D are it works best if you use a power of 2. So textures are referred to as 1K, 2K, 4K. And that stands for 2 to the power of some number. So 2048 is a common size, 4096 is a common size. So that would be 2K or 4K. For the size objects that we're making, 2K is probably more than enough. So that's 2048. And I'm just going to put that in the minimum and the maximum, and then we hit finish. And the other thing is you can set a default color. So if you know that you want to start with something black or white, we can make this, maybe we want to start with a completely white slate. We can make that white. That'll color everything white to start off with. So we're going to press finish here, and now you can see our object turned white, and it gave us a white texture with all of our polygons sort of laid out on this white sheet. And we can close this now. And so what it's done is it has created a material that you can see down here in the corner that is white, and it has wrapped it around our object, and it has made it has organized all of the polygons for our shape onto this square texture. So here you can see that if I select polygons in this view on the right, they'll highlight on the left, and I can do the same thing over here. I can select polygons on my object, and they will show up on the right. Now you'll notice though that I'm not seeing the polygons for the other shape, and that's because I'm selected on the cylinder part. If I want to see the polygons in this angled area in the front, I have to select the cube in the objects over here, and now you can see these are the rest of my my polygons. So now now that we've done this, we can just go ahead and start painting on our object. And if we need to paint sort of simple shapes, this may be all you need. You can actually just zoom in on a portion of your object. So right now, if I want to paint, I select my paintbrush on the left-hand side. When I select the paintbrush on the left-hand side, it brings up a brush preview over on the right, or in the middle here in this attributes, and I can choose the size of the brush I want, and I can also go over to my brushes and swatches tab over here to pick different colors and brush shapes. So there, it'll default to a round brush, but there are other styles of brushes in this hierarchy here. We can go down to brushes, and we can go standard tools. We can do multi-brushes. There are all sorts of patterns that you can paint with. And sometimes this is helpful for the sort of texture you're after. You can choose this. You can choose kind of blotchy brushes that might help convey something. And then we have to pick a color from the swatches. So we go over to swatches and say, I want to paint with some kind of reddish color. And a shortcut for changing the brush size is to press the middle mouse wheel and click and drag left and right. It'll make it larger or smaller. And then you can just start painting. Make small brushes. Maybe this is your blood vessels. So anyway, there's and you can see it's showing up over here on my texture, and it's showing up in my object. And maybe we want to make some kind of I don't know, bone marrow shape things over here. We can change our brush back to standard, and we can make a small, make something here. We can turn our object so we can look down on it. But you can see it's kind of difficult to make really nice patterns on here. And it might be helpful to, if you know Photoshop, to bring this into Photoshop. And I'll show you how to do that in a second. First of all, I want to show you that if we go from here out to our standard layout, you can see our object is now painted. And that'll stick with our object. There are another thing I want to show you here is the ability to in BP UV edit. We can go back here, and there are swatches that are not single colors. There are patterns. So we can choose kind of an interesting color, and let's go to our cylinder now and turn it around and maybe paint on some of this texture. And we'll make our brush much larger, and we'll start painting. You see, I can paint on, and you're not limited here to what you can. You're not limited to the edges of polygons. So if you can paint details onto and so there's a way to paint. And so you can either paint onto the object, or you can paint directly onto the texture. That's another way to do it. Okay. So when I accidentally painted onto the top right here, I can just erase that. I can pick up a white, paint that edge. Okay. All right. So that may be all you need, but I wanted to show you how to export this to Photoshop in order to make some more elaborate textures on here. Okay, in order to go into Photoshop, we want to be able to take this texture and open it directly in Photoshop, but the problem is we're not going to be able to see any of the lines that make up the borders of our polygons. They show up in here, but if we open this in Illustrator or in Photoshop, it'll just be all the lines will be gone. So what we need to do is we need to paint on those those polygon edges into our texture. And to do that, we're going to have to save this texture out as a Photoshop file. And here's where we're also going to have our documents saved. So I'm going to just do File, Save As, and I'm going to save this to just somewhere on my documents. Test, and we're going to call this test texture. And here it's asking me, do you want to save changes to the texture? And I'm going to say no, because I want to save this as a certain type of file. So this texture here, I want to say File, Save Texture As, and instead of a TIFF file, I want to save it as a Photoshop file, a PSD. That will help me when I'm going into Photoshop. So I click OK, and I go to save it. I'm going to save it to the same folder. And it's important that you save all the textures in the same folder where your object is. Documents, test, matte color 1, and we can call this whatever we want. We can call this test texture, because you might have a few of these. Okay, so now we have our texture and our Cinema 4D files saved in the same location. If I bring up a File Explorer, you can see what this looks like. Test. And so now you see I have two files in there. Test texture C4D and test texture PSD. So this is just a regular Photoshop file. But there's a couple things we have to do before we edit it in Photoshop. We're going to need to color those lines. So I'm going to go to back to Cinema 4D, and I'm going to look at this Layers tab. Now you see right now everything I've done so far has been on the background, and this is going to be okay if you're pretty sure of what you're doing, but it's nice to have different components on different layers. That way you can turn them off. And especially these polygon edges. We're going to paint them, but we don't want to show them on our scene. We just want to use them as reference when we go into Photoshop. So I'm going to make a new texture layer by clicking on this button on the far left with the plus sign. And if I hover over it, it says New Layer. So I click it, and now I've got a new layer. With my one object selected, so if I go into objects right now, I've got cylinder selected. I have to select the polygon edges. Now, right now I'm in a paintbrush, so I need to get back to being able to select the polygons. And to do that, we need to go into this polygon mode right here. So we have to select this polygon mode, and then I could click the selector tool and start selecting, but I can also type Control A and it'll select all the polygons. Now if I do that, now I have to pick a brush. I want to paint these lines, and it will paint them with the currently selected brush. So right now my brush is some kind of giant thing. I want to make that a small black brush, so I'm going to go small and make it black. 2 pixel round brush, and then go back to my polygon selection mode and make sure all the polygons are selected, and then go up to Layer, Outline Polygons. So again, that's Layer, Outline Polygons, and it will make a brush stroke around all the polygons that you have selected. Now you can see I can only do this for one object. Well, I only have one object selected. I may be able to select multiple objects. So if I do this and select cube, and then go over here and do Control A, There we go. Now I've got my other object selected. And then I do the same thing. Layer, outline polygons. Now I have a layer that contains a drawing of all the polygon edges. And this will be a good guide if we take this into Photoshop. And the other thing that we're going to do here is I've had bad luck creating layers in Photoshop and having them come back into Cinema 4D. So I'm going to create another blank layer for my art. So I'm going to just double click this name and call it artwork. And this one I'm going to call polygons. Okay. So now I can save this texture, File, Save Texture, and go and open it directly in Photoshop. So I'm going to switch over to Photoshop, and I'm going to do File, Open, and I'm going to find that document, test, and find my texture, PSD. So now you see what I've got here is it's an exact copy of what I had before. There are 3 layers: artwork, polygons, and background. We can turn them on and off. And this gives us this, if without this polygons layer, we wouldn't know where to paint. So if I wanted to put something on say the top of my object, I wouldn't know where to make it. So one thing that this is nice for is like making labels, for example. I can put a piece of text on here and call this text, and I can resize it. So I can't teach you how to use Photoshop here, but there's so I can put that there, and then you can do all the things that you can do in Photoshop. If you have a digitizing tablet, there's one in the IQ Center where you can draw on this shape in Photoshop with a pen. It's sometimes a little bit easier, and so now I can draw shapes directly on this. Maybe it's a little easier in, or maybe you have some textures that you got from somewhere else. You can paint them on. You can do a lot more detailed stuff in Photoshop. And then when I want to save this out, one little aside about text is that you see how when I make a piece of text in Photoshop, it makes it on a separate layer. So I really want to merge that with my with an existing layer, like for example my artwork layer, so that the text is part of a layer that's existing. And now I can do File, Save. Now I've saved that texture. I can close it. I can go back to Cinema 4D, and you see it's not there. And it's not there because we have to refresh it's just using the texture that we've had from before, so we have to refresh it. So we can there's a couple different ways you can do that. You can click the material in this material tab, or you can go back to the standard layout and select the material from there. But in the color tab on the material, you can see that this is where our texture is, under texture. And there's a little arrow here. I can click it and select reload image. So reload image. And it says, do you really want to revert to the saved version of this texture? I say yes. And then there's our text that we put in Photoshop. So whatever we did in Photoshop, we can add here. This is something that I don't know how to do it in this program, but in Photoshop you can do it very easily. So now if we go back to our standard layout, you can see that little piece that we put in there is in there. But you also see that our lines are in there too. So we need to get rid of those. So we're going to go back to UV edit and go into our layers and turn off polygons. And then switch back to standard. And there we are. If I click off of anything, we can see that there's our. Now, one thing you'll notice when I clicked off of my objects, the quality got quite low. You can see it looks kind of jagged. Now, don't worry too much about this. This is just an editor preview. One of the things that Cinema 4D does is it makes a low resolution preview of your textures, and you can fix that by clicking the texture and going to this editor tab and changing the default texture preview size from default to whatever it is you used. So we used, in this case, 2K, so I'll pick 2K, and you can see now it looks a lot cleaner. It looks just like our texture. All right. If you want to get right here, it previews with a little shine, so we can go into here and turn off reflectance, and it will be a little more what you're going to expect. Okay, so that's how to paint textures onto your objects in Cinema 4D. Thanks for watching.